When my grandmother passed, the old house came to me. I haven't visited it in years, but something in me couldn't bear the idea of selling it off. It was as though I owed her a goodbye, a chance to make peace with memories I didn't fully understand. The house itself was unnerving. It had that abandoned smell, a mixture of dust and age with hints of dried flowers and something stale, lingering just beneath the surface. After days of unpacking and cleaning, I finally made it to the attic. The door was stiff, wedged tightly into its frame, but with a sharp tug, it opened, revealing stacks of my grandmother's things. The air was thick, and it took a few moments to adjust to the dim light from a single bulb overhead. Then I found the doll. She was sitting on an old, wooden rocking chair, as if waiting for me. Pale porcelain face, blonde curls, dressed in a tiny green dress with lace trim. Her eyes were a piercing blue, so vivid and lifelike that I felt an odd sense of discomfort. I didn't remember her from my childhood, and yet, as I stood there, I felt as if she'd been watching me for a long, long time. Without thinking, I reached out to touch her, brushing my fingers across the cold porcelain cheek. A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I could have sworn her eyes flicked toward me. That night, I found it hard to sleep. The sounds of the house creaked around me, familiar but unsettling in the silence of the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those wide, too bright eyes, staring with a knowing expression. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a sound, a soft, almost inaudible tap-tap, like someone gently knocking. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped, but it left a pit of unease in my stomach. The next night, the tapping returned, louder this time. I got up, half asleep and irritated, and followed the noise to the hallway outside my bedroom. It seemed to be coming from above me, the attic. A shiver ran through me, and I hesitated at the base of the attic steps. I couldn't bring myself to go up, not in the dead of night. Instead, I locked my bedroom door, telling myself it was just the wind, a loose shingle or a tree branch against the house. But deep down, I knew it was her. The following day, I went up to the attic to see if I could figure out what had been making the noise. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. As I looked around, my eyes fell on the doll, still sitting in her chair, but somehow different. Her head was tilted slightly, and her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the room. I felt ridiculous even thinking it, but something about her felt aware, like she knew I was nervous, and was quietly laughing at me for it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, clutching the sheets, listening. Hours passed in near silence, but then came the tapping again. Louder, insistent, like someone was calling me. A soft, rhythmic sound crept into my ears, the faint creak of a rocking chair. I froze, my mind whirling, struggling to make sense of the noise. The doll was in the attic. It wasn't possible for the sound to carry all the way down here. But it didn't stop. Creak, creak, creak. Finally, summoning all my courage, I tiptoed down the hall and cracked open the attic door. The house was silent. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a whisper. "Come play." I was shaking as I climbed the attic stairs. My hands fumbled with the flashlight, the weak yellow beam swinging around the room, picking out shadows that seemed to lean and twist as I moved. And there she was, the doll, her head tilted farther to the side now, her face locked in a strange half-smile that hadn't been there before. I stared, feeling my heart race, as I noticed something even more chilling. Her tiny hands seemed to have shifted. They were no longer resting delicately on her lap, but extended outward, reaching. The room felt colder, and the stillness around me was unbearable. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Her head, It was slowly turning, her eyes fixing on me with a look that was far too knowing, far too alive. Panic surged, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping down the stairs. As I backed away, she stayed perfectly still, that eerie, unnatural smile still plastered on her face, watching me, daring me to come closer. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the attic. I tried to stay away from the house as much as possible, but every time I left, something would draw me back, a feeling that she was waiting, that I hadn't really escaped. One evening, as I lay in bed, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, relentless, like something desperate was clawing its way down the walls. And then, to my horror, I heard it. Footsteps, tiny but unmistakable. My chest tightened. The footsteps paused just outside my door. In the silence, I could hear a faint, high-pitched giggle, like a child's laugh, twisted and warped. The doorknob rattled, then slowly began to turn. Couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The door creaked open an inch, then two, then three, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears until the only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat, hammering against my ribs. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the door was open. She was gone. But from somewhere in the darkness, I swear I heard her voice. "I'll be waiting." I stayed in a motel that night, telling myself it was just for a day or two, just long enough to clear my head. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those glassy, unblinking blue eyes, that impossible smile, and the way her small, porcelain fingers had curled around that brass key. Just as I was drifting off, a noise jolted me awake. I held my breath, straining to hear, hoping it was only my imagination. But there it was again, faint tapping like fingers rapping against glass. Slowly, I turned my head toward the motel window. A small figure stood outside, barely visible in the shadows. She was staring up at me, her head tilted, her eyes shining with that terrible blue glint in the dim light. She lifted her hand and tapped the window, slowly, rhythmically. I staggered back, my pulse pounding, as her smile widened. Her hand moved to the window latch, and I watched, helpless, as it began to jiggle. The latch moved with tiny, insistent jerks, as if she were trying to figure out how to work it open. The room suddenly felt unbearably cold. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, barely stopping to breathe as I bolted down the hall and into my car. I didn't care where I was going, anywhere but there. But as I sped away, the darkness seemed to press in on me. I glanced into the rearview mirror and nearly veered off the road. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her eyes watching me with an unsettling calm, her head slightly tilted. I heard a faint giggle, and then her voice, soft and clear. "Why are you running?" I swerved, slamming on the brakes, but when I looked back, the seat was empty. I sat there, heart hammering, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I looked at the passenger seat, I saw it, her small brass key, gleaming faintly in the dark. In a daze, I returned to the house. I don't know what drove me back, but it felt as though I had no choice, like I was being pulled there. The house loomed, dark and silent, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Inside, the air was colder than I remembered, thick with a strange, musty smell that reminded me of the attic. I could feel something watching me, hovering just beyond the shadows. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked, each step heavier, as though the house itself resisted my presence. I found myself at the foot of the attic stairs. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, the brass key cold in my hand, almost pulsing, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The door swung open, and I felt a rush of frigid air, carrying the faintest sound of a rocking chair, creaking in the dark. The doll was waiting at the top of the stairs, her head tilted, her eyes wide, and that same terrible smile frozen on her face. Only now her arms were stretched out, reaching toward me as if to welcome me back. "Come play," she whispered. A cold dread filled me, rooting me to the spot. I watched, horrified, as her body twitched, and she took one small, jerking step toward me. Then another. Her movements were wrong, unnatural, as if she were a puppet with invisible strings, each step precise but horribly stiff. I backed away, nearly tripping over myself as I stumbled down the stairs. But she kept coming, her porcelain feet tapping against the wood, her head twitching from side to side, that fixed smile somehow growing wider, more sinister. I reached the bottom step, but my foot caught on something, and I tumbled backward, sprawling onto the floor. She stood over me, her face impossibly close, her eyes glinting in the dim light. Her mouth began to move, the porcelain cracking and shifting as her smile twisted into a hideous grimace. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice barely more than a hiss. "You belong here now." I scrambled backward, my hands frantically searching for anything to shield myself. But my fingers found something cold. Another small brass key, identical to the first. I looked down, and dozens of keys lay scattered across the floor, gleaming in the dark. Behind her, I saw shadows moving, shapes emerging from the corners of the room. Dolls, dozens of them, all with those same lifeless eyes and twisted smiles. They began to move toward me, surrounding me, their tiny hands reaching out, as if eager to pull me into their endless, silent ranks. Panic surged through me as they closed in, their porcelain fingers grazing my skin, cold and unyielding. I tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating. I could feel their hands pressing down on me, the weight of them growing as they piled on, pinning me to the ground. Their fingers were cold, brittle, yet strong, pressing against my arms, my chest, even my face, as though they were trying to smother me. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in, tightening around me. I struggled, desperately trying to pull free, but my limbs felt heavy, almost numb, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't shake them off. Above me, the doll's face loomed closer, her blue eyes glinting with that unnatural, malicious light. Her mouth moved, forming words, but this time, no sound came out, only a faint hiss, like static. And then, in that twisted silence, she began to laugh. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, thin and sharp, echoing from somewhere deep inside her tiny body. The other dolls joined in, their mouths stretching wide, a chorus of silent laughter filling the air, chilling and somehow deafening, though I heard no sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to will myself back to reality. But then I felt something sharp dig into my hand. My eyes flew open, and I saw that one of the dolls had a jagged crack running down its cheek. The edges pressed against my skin, digging in, scratching as if to tear something from me. They were getting closer, their weight pressing down harder, and I could feel myself sinking, the floor beneath me giving way, as though it were pulling me into some unseen depth. "No, stop," I gasped, my voice a faint, trembling whisper. But my words seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the darkness that was spreading around me. Suddenly, the porcelain doll leaned down so close that I could feel the cold, stale air that seemed to seep from her cracked mouth. Her eyes, those glassy blue eyes, filled my vision. They weren't empty. They held something in them, something hungry, something aware. "You're one of us now," she whispered, Her voice no longer a childish giggle, but a low, guttural rasp. Her words vibrated through me, sinking into my bones. The floor beneath me seemed to shift, almost melting away, and a dense, choking darkness began to rise around me, swallowing my legs, creeping up my torso. I felt it squeezing tighter, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if my very essence was being drained, pulled into the cold, hollow shells of those dolls. With my last ounce of strength, I clawed at the floor, searching for anything to hold on to, but my hands only met emptiness. I looked up, my vision blurring, and saw her face. The doll grinning down at me with a satisfaction that felt almost triumphant. In a final, fading moment of clarity, I understood. She hadn't just wanted to terrify me. She had wanted me, wanted my life, my energy, to fill the hollow space inside her. But in that sliver of realization, something shifted. I felt a spark, a last trace of myself, buried beneath the weight of her darkness. Somewhere deep inside, a surge of willpower flared up, pushing against her grip. I fought, resisting the pull of her cold embrace, clawing desperately at any remnant of myself I could still feel. I focused on the last real thing I had, a single memory of sunlight filtering through my grandmother's kitchen window. I held on to it with everything I had left, letting it grow in my mind, letting it warm me from the inside out. The darkness around me recoiled, hissing and twisting as if burned. I felt the weight begin to lift, the grip of the doll's hands loosening as I forced the memory to spread, filling every inch of my mind. The sound of their laughter faded, replaced by a furious, guttural growl that echoed through the shadows. "No!" she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "You belong to me." But I kept pushing back, feeling strength return to my limbs, the warmth of my own heartbeat fighting against her icy grip. With a final, desperate shove, I broke free, gasping as I stumbled back into the light of the attic. The dolls writhed around me, their hollow eyes seething with anger, but they didn't move. They stayed frozen, almost as if my defiance had trapped them in place. My eyes fell on the brass key lying on the floor, glinting faintly in the dim light. I knew then what I had to do. My grandmother's voice, faint and distant, seemed to echo in my mind, as if guiding me. The hearth. I reached the living room, where the old stone fireplace stood, its grate rusted from years of disuse. My hands shook as I grabbed the key, feeling it grow hotter in my grasp, almost as if it were alive. Behind me, the shadows twisted, and I could feel her presence drawing closer, the cold tightening around me as her voice filled the room. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice a sickly, honeyed tone. "You're part of us now." Ignoring her, I thrust the key into the hearth's flames. The heat was immediate, intense, as if I'd unleashed something dormant within the fire itself. The key sparked and hissed, glowing a fierce, blinding red. A scream ripped through the room, piercing and furious, shaking the walls. I looked up to see her face in the shadows, twisted with rage and pain, the porcelain cracking and splintering as she reached out, desperate to pull me back. But her grip weakened, her form beginning to fade. One by one, I saw the other dolls slumping, their bodies crumbling to dust as the light from the fire spread, filling every corner of the room with a warm, relentless glow. I stumbled backward, clutching the wall, barely able to keep my balance as the house trembled around me. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted in agony, her mouth open in a final silent scream as she was pulled into the flames, dissolving into ash. And then silence. The air cleared, the cold dissipated, and the house settled into an eerie calm. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for any sign of her return, but there was only quiet. The oppressive feeling had lifted. The house felt lighter, warmer, as if whatever curse had haunted it was finally gone. I left that night, never looking back. But as I closed the door, I could have sworn I heard one last faint whisper, almost gentle, as though carried on a fading breeze. Until next time,